This is a brief video, a follow-up to the earlier videos that I have done discussing the negotiations between the Russians and the Americans, which took place in Geneva on Monday. On Wednesday, as I've said previously, as I've discussed previously, there was a follow-up meeting between the Americans and the Russians, and the European countries were there, the NATO member states were there. The meeting took place within the format of the NATO-Russia Council. And this meeting was basically set up for no other purpose, or so it seems to me, than in order that the United States could reassure its European and NATO allies that their security would not be discussed between the Russians and the Americans bilaterally without the NATO states being themselves involved. But as I have previously said, the substantive negotiations are the ones which are taking place bilaterally between the Americans and the Russians. The meeting which took place in Brussels within the format of the NATO-Russia Council was essentially a briefing exercise. It was one in which the Russians came along and had the opportunity to set out their positions and set out many of the same positions which they took more substantively in the 8 hours of negotiations between which they conducted with the Americans a few days before in Geneva. And the result is completely predictable. No progress, no movement at all. Having said that, perhaps none should be expected, and the discussions, which lasted apparently for all of 4 hours, would have given the Russians an opportunity not only to state their views, but also presumably to answer any questions that would have been put to them by NATO officials, by the NATO Secretariat, which, by the way, remains implacably hostile and gives me the strong impression of being extremely unhappy and hostile to the very fact that these discussions between the Americans and the Russians are going on, and of course to any NATO states which wanted to float any ideas or perhaps inquire of the Russians what their points might be. As to that, by the way, I suspect that we would have probably heard some grandstanding from some of the more hardline states, from the representatives in NATO of the more hardline states, Poland, the Baltic states, Britain, and the rest. I suspect that the Germans and the French would have, to a very great extent, kept their own counsel. We know that both the Germans and the French are planning their own separate, independent diplomatic initiative with the Russians, which will no doubt be underway shortly. Anyway, who was leading the Russian delegation to NATO? And that perhaps is an interesting fact, because it was not Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister who's in charge of the discussions with the Americans. The Russians sent an entirely different official, who is Alexander Grushko, another deputy foreign minister, and importantly, the person who is Russia's ambassador to NATO. So Grushko is familiar with NATO, and he knows the NATO Secretariat and the people there. And by the way, if you follow Russian media, he gives quite often a running commentary for Russian viewers, for the Russian media, on Russia's relations with NATO. And this has been an ongoing story and an ongoing practice of his for quite a long while now. Well, Grushko, it's important to stress, however, is not the lead negotiator. That is Ryabkov. The fact that Ryabkov was not heading this delegation, which went to Brussels to brief NATO about the discussions with the Americans on Monday, that perhaps tells us that the Russians are not particularly concerned about this meeting in Brussels with NATO. The person they are sending is not Ryabkov, their lead negotiator, but Grushko, who is, of course, already, as I said, somebody whose job it is to talk to NATO anyway. Anyway, Grushko gave a press conference, and it was an interesting one. Now, lamentably, the Russian Foreign Ministry, one of its fundamental weaknesses is that it is unbelievably slow in publishing English translations of transcripts of press conferences that senior Russian diplomats give. There's been much complaint about this, by the way, on the part of many people. The people who are in charge of the Russian Foreign Ministry's website need to get their act together, but never seem to do. But regardless, we have had film of this press conference. It was broadcast live, and we've also had what is an extremely useful summary from Sputnik, from Russia-NATO, the Russian publishing agency. And it is to that Sputnik summary that I'm going. And we see a number of things that Grushko said. And there's long extracts, and I've no doubt that they convey the flavour of the discussions. By the way, I should say in parenthesis, I'm going to focus on the Russian take in these discussions. I've read the kind of things that Stoltenberg and other NATO officials have said, and it seems to me that that's very much, if you like, more of the same. Anyway, these are the kind of things that Grushko was saying. Today's meeting was devoted precisely to the analysis of the factors affecting the degradation of European security, which we have observed in recent years. One of these factors is NATO's constant expansion towards Russia over the past 2.5 decades. Let me remind you that in 1997 there was only one country sharing a border with Russia knocking on NATO's door. That was Poland. Today many countries have joined the alliance, and their territory is being openly used to project power against Russia from various geographic locations and into its strategic interior. This seriously worsens our security and contains unacceptable risks for our security, which we will confront. Moscow will have no choice but to implement a policy of counter-containment and counter-intimidation if we fail to reverse the current very dangerous course of events. Very honestly, the Russian side very informed its NATO counterparts very honestly, directly, without trying to get around sharp corners or using politically correct formulas. Lots an interesting point, by the way, but never mind, that a further worsening of the situation could lead to the most unpredictable and dire consequences for European security. Russia is not in favour of such a scenario. The Western Bloc, however, dedicates colossal resources towards efforts to contain Russia and does not even attempt to conceal that containment is the alliance's primary mission. This fact has a destructive impact on attempts to build common European security on a different set of principles. And then Sputnik says that Grushko also accused the US and its allies of seeking to achieve superiority in all operating environments, on the ground, in the air, at sea, and now in space and cyberspace. And he went on to stress that the security proposals outlined by Russia last month, that's the 2 draft treaties, and which were discussed over the course of the NATO-Russia Council meeting, serve to improve not only the military security of the Russian Federation, but also the security of the NATO countries themselves, especially those that today call themselves the frontline states. Grushko then went on to say that the termination of NATO's open door policy in relation to Ukraine and other countries of Eastern Europe is an absolute imperative for Moscow, and he rejected NATO's arguments about some sort of freedom of choice The words he used were, the freedom to choose to ensure one's security must not be exercised in such a way as to infringe on the legitimate security interests of others. And membership in military alliances should take into account the security interests of others. These are direct requirements of international obligations recorded in many international legal documents. He's absolutely right about that. It's also, by the way, a principle set out in the United Nations Charter. Anyway, he then discussed NATO expansion and pointed out that it had not solved any problems in the field of security. It does not erase dividing lines, but only brings them forward in the direction where the bloc is expanding. Unfortunately, by NATO's decision, all practical cooperation between Russia and the alliance in areas of common interest have been suspended. Today, we do not have any unifying agenda, none at all. And then he went on to say that whilst Moscow is prepared to review the total breakdown in regular communication with NATO, that will only happen if NATO changes its course and ends its attempts to dictate the size of Russia's diplomatic representation at the NATO headquarters. It's a major issue, by the way. The Russians essentially ended all contact with NATO after Stoltenberg and the NATO Secretariat expelled 8 Russian diplomats. Grushko is essentially saying that there is no way that the Russians will resume those contacts unless that position is reversed and unless NATO accepts that the Russians can send as many diplomats to NATO as they wish. That's, I suspect, something that sooner or later NATO might want to concede. But anyway, to continue, Grushko then went on to discuss the situation with respect to Ukraine. He said that Moscow sees de-escalation as possible, but that for it to be achieved, the current government in Kiev must adopt the Minsk peace agreements aimed at finally ending the frozen civil war in the country's east. If the Minsk agreements are implemented, there will be no threat to Ukraine's security nor to its territorial integrity. And Grushko went on to say that whilst Moscow is ready for dialogue with NATO on missile deployments, with proposals on this issue also contained in Russia's draft treaties, on the issue of verification of deployment, the ball is in NATO's court, with Russia formulating its proposals and declaring its readiness to talk a long time ago. And then Grushko apparently characterized the talks at NATO as quite frank, direct, deep, but revealing of a large number of differences on fundamental issues. And he went on to say, one of the main issues is that NATO understands the principles of the indivisibility of security in a selective manner. In NATO's eyes, it exists only for members of the alliance, and in its practical actions, the bloc has no plans to take into account the security interests of others. Russia proceeds from the principle of common security. Any attempts to build security against Russia and without Russia's participation are counterproductive and destined to fail. And then he said that ultimately, Grushko expects that NATO will eventually either accept Russia's security proposals and present their own views on the means to their implementation, or reject them directly and offer a concrete explanation as to why they are unacceptable. So that's incredibly tough language. It shows the Russians in a completely uncompromising mood. And by the way, perhaps in order to reinforce the fact that there is a mailed fist lurking in the background, we received news that the Russians have conducted further military exercises in European Russia within striking range of Ukraine. And if you think that's a coincidence, well, as I often like to say, I have a bridge to sell you. But anyway, let's go back and consider some of the points that Grushko is making, and we can tick them off very, very quickly. Now, in effect, Grushko has made two essential points. Well, he's made several points, but he's made two essential points. He's made the point that NATO's eastward expansion, far from bringing security to Europe, is what is the cause of this underlying crisis and deterioration in relations between Russia and what the Russians increasingly now refer to as the collective West. If this trend continues, then the Russians will take countermeasures. And he was absolutely explicit about this. Now, the sort of countermeasures the Russians are going to take, well, so one of them we already know. They've already declared red lines. They have already made clear that if Ukraine or Georgia were to enter NATO, that crosses Russia's red lines, and Russia would react, and there would be a war in Ukraine, a war which NATO cannot fight and which Ukraine would lose. So, as I have explained on numerous occasions, that in effect already means that Ukraine and Georgia are not going to join NATO. But perhaps more pertinently, Grushko says that unless the Russians get the legally binding security guarantees that they are seeking, then Russia will start to take counter steps. They will start to act in a way that, as he puts it, they will implement a policy of counter-containment and counter-intimidation. Now, that's an extraordinarily interesting point, and it does point to a very serious military escalation in Europe and in the North Atlantic region. Now, I'm not going to go over the various things that I've discussed about that the Russians might do. I've focused many times in many programs about the potential effect of the Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone and the deadly effect it could have on the cities on the American coast, the west coast of the United States, and indeed also the east coast of the United States. And I've also discussed other weapon systems like the Burestvenik nuclear-powered cruise missile and such things. But it seems to me that what Grushko is also hinting at is that given that there's going to be this increase in tension, this increase in counter-intimidation by Russia of the West, there will not be any arms control agreements of substance agreed between the Russians and the Americans until this issue of legally binding security guarantees is resolved. The Americans and the Europeans will be faced over the next few years with a steadily deteriorating security climate, and that will be one which will affect the Americans, the continental United States itself, in the most visible way. And I think that's one important takeaway that we can draw from this, and that's, I think, what we're going to increasingly see and where this thing is now heading. But the other thing that Grushko said is that he did point, with respect to Ukraine, to one possible way forward which could de-escalate tensions. He talked again about the Minsk agreement. He said that if the Minsk agreement were fully implemented, if Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, talked as it is obliged to do, as it is required to do by the Minsk agreement with the leaders of the two republics of the Donbass, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, if it implemented the Minsk agreement, if it negotiated with those two republics the issue of autonomy for those republics, if it accepted federalization or decentralization of power in Ukraine itself, if it agreed to a new constitution and to the formation after elections of a new government of national unity, then at that point there would be no further threat to Ukraine. There would be no question of a war there. The Ukrainian conflict could be settled, and that would lead to a de-escalation, a diffusing of the crisis in Europe. Obviously, were such a thing to happen, if the republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, were to be so empowered within a decentralized, federalized Ukraine, well then at that point obviously the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO would in effect disappear, because the political forces that would be involved in Ukrainian political affairs would be so balanced that there would be an overwhelmingly strong force to reject Ukraine's NATO membership. That is a possible route to a de-escalation of the crisis. And by the way, at this point, I'm just going to make one observation about some of the things that Wendy Sherman has been saying. Wendy Sherman being the lead US negotiator. She gave a press conference which I have to say, though it didn't deviate in any fundamental way from the American positions, the NATO positions, did strike me as a lot more measured and much more sane than the kind of frankly deranged comments we've been hearing from people like Tony Blinken and in effect from Jens Stoltenberg. In fact, it reminded me of that difference in tone between Blinken and the press conference he gave and the off-the-record briefing by the mysterious senior administration official in the White House, somebody who I suspect is Jake Sullivan, who seemed to take a much more measured line to the negotiations, to the discussions than Blinken does. And it does suggest to me, it reinforces my feeling that there is a split within the administration about how to approach this thing. The hardliners, people like Blinken, Nuland, and all the others, they want to press on with confrontation against Russia. They're not prepared to give an inch. As far as they're concerned, it's the Russians who are to blame for everything. Others, perhaps Sullivan, possibly Sherman, take a more measured, more rational line. But the key point is that Sherman said that NATO has an open door and it can't prevent any country that wishes to join NATO from applying to do so. Now, that perhaps might suggest, and I don't want to read more into those words than perhaps is actually intended, but it might suggest that there might be some people in Washington, somebody within the administration, who see a possible way out of this problem by persuading Ukraine to drop its request to join NATO. Now that, I have to say, would be an extremely difficult thing to do. Certainly the current Ukrainian government would never agree to it. But it would be, if it could be achieved, it would be a way for the US to get off this particular hook. And perhaps the way to do it would be to reactivate the Minsk process, get this new government of national unity set up, have this government of national unity withdraw the application for NATO membership, and that would diffuse the problem in Europe without the United States having publicly to go back on its commitment of an open-ended invitation by NATO to every state to join it, except presumably Russia itself. So that's perhaps some people's thinking. The problem is massive, and I'm not going to insist on that interpretation. Perhaps I'm reading more into what Sherman said than perhaps was intended, and as I said, I'm not going to press the point. Anyway, there we are. It seems to me that this round of negotiations is now practically at an end. There will be further talks between the Americans and the Russians. I doubt that they will move very much further for the moment. I reiterate my essential point. From now on, it seems to me that what we're going to see is that the Russians will gradually dial up the pressure with new military deployments, new weapon systems, new areas of tension around Europe, until the Americans and NATO finally put aside their rhetoric and sit down and talk. That may take a while. We're in, as I said, for a very bumpy ride before that happens, but I suspect that is the trajectory of travel. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon on this channel and on our various other channels, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, and especially and on our other platforms like Locals, where I now do live streams and publish exclusive content, as do many of our community there. You can find links under this video. You can also, if you like this video, you can press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there, like our famous magic mugs and t-shirts and all the rest. Well, that's enough from me today. I look forward, as I said to you joining me again soon, both on this channel and on Locals and on our other platforms. And until then, have a very good day.